Context is king, and I've heard that same thing said a number of different ways. That in life there are things that happen, and then there's a story that everybody tells about what happened. So one of the things I'm going to do today is reflect on the idea that before you choose your tools and techniques, you must choose your vision and values. So I'm going to review the objectives for today's convening, for the convening, which will happen over 2 days, and really focus a little bit on what we're trying to accomplish in terms of the vision and the values that we hope to really be the platform that we have this discussion, where we have this discussion. And looking over the objectives, everybody got it's on the agenda, everybody got it in their packet. I see 3 major themes, and I'll try and be brief because I only have 10 minutes. But the 3 themes from the objectives, as I see them, are we want to review, reconnect, and maybe reimagine CED as we look at CED 50 years later, CED at 50. One of the things that we hope to happen, and pulling this event together, one of the things that we looked at was one of our objectives was to bring together practitioners, people who've been doing the work, who've been involved in the field, and give them an opportunity to reflect on, well, what has been accomplished? What were we trying to do? And what did we do? And what difference did it actually make? One way of looking at that is looking at the social and the economic conditions of the both society, but also the constituency for CED 50 years ago and today. When we do that, I think we'll see some similarities, and that'll tell us something. It'll tell us, it'll help us to think about both the similarities and the differences, and what do they mean for much of the work that's being done today by young folk. I know earlier today, in discussions with Kareem Aziz, we were talking about some of the work that he's done, and some of the work that we maybe are continuing to do even now. And part of the wisdom that Kareem brought was in the old comment that you turn to old men for counsel and young men for war. So, we're hoping to bring some of that energy and some of that dynamic as part of our objectives through the dialogue today. And finally, we want to look at the theoretical, the sociological, and the economic implications of what we've done, what's happening today, and what that can mean for our future as we move into the future. How do we take those lessons and apply them? What lessons can we draw from what we've done as we think about moving into the future? As Michael said earlier, we had the opportunity to sort of think about a gathering and an event that wasn't necessarily this, but this becomes what we're doing now, and what we have an opportunity to do today can and will inform what we do as we go forward. One of the things I want to say is that as part of our objectives, we have a series of facilitators who will be drawn from among us, because one of the things that we definitely want to have everybody engage and give their input, offer their insights, voice their opinions, even share some of their not fully formed thoughts, but reflections that they may have. One of the challenges that often happen in this kind of gathering is some of the most important stuff is left unsaid. So we want to encourage you today to say it and let's begin the conversation. So, the first, as you see, we're going to have a series of discussions, and the first will be the overview by Mtangulizi. And he's going to give us his overview because, as I mentioned earlier, as our friend Ari Meredazan said, context is king. So he's going to provide that.
Thank you very much again, Woullard, and good afternoon to you, each and every one of you. And it's very good to see all of you here. Within the context of within the package that you received, you will note in the document something that is called the overview. And does everybody see that? It's where the description of the sessions takes place, each session and what is to take place, the conversation to take place in each session is described in this document. And we put all of that together to try to, again, provide for you a framework to understand why we chose the conversations that we did choose for the agenda, because this could have been a very elastic kind of conference that covered a wide range of subject matters and topics, but we had to narrow it for a lot of very practical reasons. And so, as you can see, it's looking at this issue of the relationship between community economic development as a social justice activity and the social justice movements of today. That's really what the narrowing of the focus of all of this is all about. It's not just about community economic development generically or in general, nor is it a pure evaluation of everybody's practice, good, bad, or indifferent, right or wrong. But it is making an assumption that there is a justice practice that CED is associated with. You may or may not associate your work with justice. If you don't, then perhaps silence is the best avenue for you to pursue this conversation. But hopefully that's not who you are, and I'm just kidding with you about that, because I'm sure all of you do work that is indeed justice oriented. There's nobody here who does work that's designed to maintain oppression and exploitation of no human being in the world. I don't believe that to be the case. Not if you know Michael Swack or Woullard Lett. I don't believe that to be the case at all. But on the more serious side, the practice itself can be considered in the larger sense a part of the larger justice movement that produced it. Because it didn't happen because some theoretical economist generated the concept. It didn't happen because some sociologist came up with the language. It didn't happen because some smart policy analyst contrived it or conceived it. It happened because people involved in struggles for justice in their neighborhoods and communities began the process of organizing what they do. So I'm going to quickly read over what the overview language says, if I can see it clearly myself here. Okay. This presentation will situate the origins of CED pre and post Title VII. Title VII, for those of you who are not aware, was the public policy instrument that formalized what we call community development corporations. Okay? Title VII was the act of the Office of Economic Opportunities Anti-Poverty Program, which was adopted into law in 1964. And it added a title specifically called Title VII, and that title was the title that was used to fund the first CDCs, Community Development Corporations. So this language is saying that prior to the evolution of the Title VII program and during Title VII, that there's this connection back to the civil rights and African American liberation movement. He goes on to point out here that this was the social justice movement, that activists had begun developing theoretical constructs to transform the relationships between the dominant white society and the sublimated and subjected black community. The overview will suggest that in the current context, the disparities and inequities can be addressed by inclusion of economic justice issues into the movement of today, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically what that argument is that in order to properly grasp the essence and the heart and the soul of what community economic development was trying to get at, one must go back to the social movement that birthed it and that produced it. So that's what I'm going to try to briefly contextualize with a couple of things that I want to review here on the chart itself. First of all, in the early days, the language community economic development was not the language that was used. In the early days, the language was community control. Community control. Anybody here remember the Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle for schools? Right. That was one of the early examples of a nascent community development process happening where the residents were struggling for community control of the school system, community control of education, where parents believed that they and the families of the children in the school system are the ones who should control public education. It seems like a rather obvious concept, right? But in those days it was radical and revolutionary and caused quite a bit of attention. So community control was among the early language that was used. OEO chose the language community capitalism, which many of us radically objected to because of many of us believe that our worldviews were not found in the system that we call capitalism in American society.
We want every word captured for posterity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Both of these are working too. This one is working too, if
Yeah.
I'm correct. Okay, all right.
So-
Thank you for that. So anyway, the early forms of the social movement was not always precise in what to call any and all of this, but the instinct was precise. The instinct that we were living in dominated communities where the people who lived there were like subjected, living in a subjected colony, that they were colonial subjects to the society outside of them. There was a book called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, written by Carmichael and the political scientist Hamilton, and they used the domestic colony analogy to describe the communities that African Americans and many other poor people were living in. But they precisely developed this analog between colonies in the so-called developing and third world and African American communities as colonial relations. And they specifically documented that control of those communities was outside of the community, by outside administrators, by outside institutions, by outside persons, and that between the school systems, the information systems, the cultural apparatus, and the police, that the people who lived in those communities were indeed subjected to colonial type relationships, dominated by race, exploited by class, and both oppressed and exploited by gender. That was the analysis that was coming out of the bowels of the African American liberation movement in the early 60s, before the CDC process started. As a matter of fact, was immediately before. When we look at much of the conditions today with what's happening in cities, the presence of social movements, economic justice issues, race, class, and gender oppression and exploitation, and global changes, it's an amazing parallel to what was happening then. These were among the conditions that we saw happening in the United States, with the added element of the intensity of the attacks by the military state. When I say the military state here, I mean communities that we lived in had become militarized. Let us not forget Harlem of 1964, where there was what you today would call a riot, which many people simply call a response to their oppression and a rebellion. Watts in 1965, there was a response to oppression. Newark, 1967. Detroit, 1967. There were uprisings coming out of these colonial environments in response to the extent of the oppression that we face. Today, it translates as Ferguson. Today, it translates as Baltimore. And tomorrow, it may translate as Chicago. or it could be New York. It could be any place in America where people are feeling the intensity of their oppression and exploitation. Rebellion takes place. That was prominent in the times of the 60s. And as a matter of fact, the policymakers at OEO were very clear in their discussions that they were looking for some way to obviate and to mediate the level of uprisings taking place by young African American men in those inner city cities. And so the notion was, maybe if we can create some business enterprises and produce some jobs, that might help to alleviate the problem. That may at least provide these young men who are burning up these cities an alternative. It may give them something else to do other than burn down the city if they have a stake, excuse me, if they have a stake in the neighborhoods. Sounds similar to what we're hearing today in the cities where movements are taking place and where rebellions are happening. You still hear the language that maybe there needs to be something else for that population to do other than burn their own communities down. But it is precisely that language that one heard back in the day. The social movements of that time were the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the student movement. You all remember SDS? The women's movement, the farmers movement, what we then call the ecology movement. There was a whole range of social movements that were in motion that the civil rights movement, many think, had spawned off. At least if you read some of the analysis of social analysts today, they would contend that many of those social movements were spin-offs from the early civil rights days in the 60s. Well, today we have social movements. We have Occupy. We have Black Lives Matter. We have progressive hip hop. We have environmental justice. Did I leave any of them out? We've got the livable wage movement that is emerging. We have newly informed women's rights movements that are emerging. There are social movements that are percolating around the country today, and they are raising this question of inequality all over again. It hasn't disappeared. Inequality was the basis of the protest then. It is the basis of the protest now, because at the end of the day, these communities that all of you work in are described by deep inequalities, by income, by occupational differences, educational differences, quality of life outcomes, defined people's options then, and nothing seems to have changed today. So social movements are evident now as then. The EJ issue, economic justice, the 1% issue, the 10% issue. It's more elegant today in the descriptions, Chuck. The analysis is a little deeper than it was back then. But at the end of the day, one saw this deep disparity in wealth and access to the material goods of the American political economy. One saw it then, one sees it now. We talk about it more now. We're able to say it now. We're able to say that there is a 1%. And a Bernie Sanders can say that and not be considered. I mean, you don't have to get the CIA to go lock him up. Back then, if you said that, you might get locked up. But objectively speaking, the data keeps pointing to this widening gap around economic issues, that there's a sense of deep economic injustice in the country, that fewer and fewer people are in control of more and more of the resource. That problem existed then. It exists now, except now more people are articulating it. More people are willing to say that this is a real problem, and that our neighborhoods and our communities aren't just poor, but there is deep economic inequality in the totality of the society, not just in the communities where lower income populations reside, that there's a deeper structural problem with the way income is obtained and distributed in the society. And that is part of what produces the EJ question, the economic justice question, which was prevalent then and is prevalent now as well. As I mentioned before, the race, class, and gender inequality issue has become explosive now. Again, we can say it and we can be clear about it in ways that we perhaps were not in the past. In the past, we articulated most of the oppression as racial. White supremacy did not emerge as a theoretical idea.
It emerged as a rationalization and for the exploitation of the European capitalist system to dominate and exploit people of color around the world. And I say that unapologetically, and will defend it against anybody who wants to fight on this one. I'll go to the mat. Racism, white supremacy, is not some imaginary idea. Race is a fiction. I mean, in objective reality, there's one race, it's called Homo sapiens. But it's a fiction. It's a social construct designed to perpetuate white supremacy in the world. And if you don't understand that, then you miss the whole question of what is it we're fighting against. We're not fighting against people. We're fighting against a system that people have developed to perpetuate oppression and exploitation of other people. Do you think men pay women less money just because they don't like women? I don't think so. Do you think black people have been exploited just because there is something inherent to some white people to exploit most black people? I don't quite think it works that way. There's profit. There's money to be made by exploiting other people. Take the profit out of the exploitive industry, and you at least can control whether you keep your foot on my neck. You still may not like me. Well, that's all right. But I just want to make sure you don't exploit me. And so we've got infected in our society with this false concept that race is at the center of how we define life. Nothing could be further from the truth. But when we were fighting this struggle 50 years ago, racial de jure segregation was real. I couldn't get on a bus and sit in the front. I couldn't stay at the hotel that I'm staying at right now. I may not have been able to attend most universities in America. I couldn't buy a soda at a lunch counter. Hallelujah. But that was how we understood the issue and problem of race at that time. But we're smarter than that now, because we know that it's a fiction. It's an imaginary fiction designed by some to perpetuate their privileges and their presumed supremacy over others. But we know that to be false. And we can see that there are other inequities in the system that can be explained by these institutional relationships that obtain between people in the system. And so that was prevalent then, but it is even clearer to us now that oppression and exploitation are twins. So there's domination by race across the board. There's exploitation by class within race, just like there is within other groupings. So when we look at the data, we see that there is still deep racism in American society. There's deep, deep poverty in the African American community. One of the articles that was sent to you analyzes the last 50 years of what has happened to African Americans. We were looking at the March on Washington, asking the question, how much progress has been made? When you look at the data, when you look at the numbers, you see that there is a deep class divide inside the African American population, as there is among other ethnic groups as well, where there is a middle class, but there's also a marginalized, impoverished class. For African Americans, 2/3 of the population is impoverished and marginal in that way. And that is the 2/3 that's trying to burn the cities down. That's the 2/3 that the police are attacking all the time. You haven't heard about police shooting and killing middle-class African Americans recently, except the case that just happened in Oklahoma, where there was a former police who raped 13 black women and had gotten away with it for a whole year. Many of them were middle class, but most of them were working class. And so it seems as though the fact that we have this evident class division among African Americans has made it a little bit easier for them to be targeted because of their position in the food chain, their position in the pyramid of wealth and power. So we've got these new dynamics that have happened that were not evident 50 to 60 years ago. All black people do not have to live in a so-called black community anymore. The Latino community is not all in the barrio. Black folks aren't all in the ghetto, quote unquote. there has been dispersion from place. There's been dispersion from what we would call a low-income community into suburban areas. And some of that has been forced because gentrification has moved people out. So we've got a different dynamic to look at as it relates to the way the inequality system works by race, by class, and by gender that was not as evident in the past, but still as severe in terms of marginalization of people. And then the global changes that have taken place. Back 60 years ago, it was decolonization. Countries that had been colonized by European societies and America and all of the other capitalist countries of the world were fighting just for their independence, just to simply throw off the yoke of colonialism. Well, in most of the urban cities, we've thrown off the formal yokes because we have people who are mayors of many of our cities now who are African Americans, who are women, and some whom are even progressive. So that form of decolonization has taken place. We've got a lot more elected officials in legislatures and city councils, on school boards, but the money is still deeply segregated. The wealth is still deeply segregated. So the question is, what has changed? Maybe the appearance of things has changed, but the substance of things has remained the same. The concentration of the resources in the hands of the same group of people that was there before. But the changes that have happened in the whole of the world look similar to what has happened to African Americans, or what has happened there looks similar to what has happened here, in which you have changed the face of administrative power, but the substance, which is the distribution of the resources of the system, remains in the same hands it has always remained in, no matter who is managing the system. So there's similarity, but dissimilarity all at the same time. Well, the sum of all of this equals basically that economic justice is as serious an issue today as it was when we started the community economic development movement almost 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, it was called Community Economic Development Movement. Not industry, but movement, because it involved efforts at social justice to reconcile all of these exploitive and oppressive relationships, not just to add material production units to a community or a neighborhood, but to change the relationships that obtain between people. So as we move to the next chart to make things simpler, I want to point out that there were at least 5 variables that were involved: community control, empowerment, dependency reduction, self-reliance, or self-determination, which was also called by many of us Ujamaa, Kujichagulia, which were the Swahili words which were used to describe what we were fighting for. Elimination of white supremacy, as I mentioned before, and institutional racism. These were among the explanations we offered in neighborhoods and communities about why we were doing community development, specifically community economic development. It was for community control of all the resources and decisions in that community. It was to empower people and help them develop capacity and skills to control their own lives, build their own institutions, and help support their own families. We certainly thought self-reliance was a noble goal and objective, that people could take care of themselves and provide the goods and services that they needed in their own communities. Of course, working with external communities on how to do that. Self-determination, eliminating white supremacy, eliminating white supremacy, eliminating white supremacy, and institutional racism. And everybody may not have seen this latter point the same way, but most of us did see it the same way because we saw that as the larger framework to understand how the problem of race had been fictionalized in America and was used to dupe everybody, which is why we were saying, you know, lower income Anglos would not necessarily support their own self-interest because race was used as the bad boy. Whenever you want to control a social movement in America, just raise the race card. So I just laugh when people talk about, oh, you raised the race card. Well, the race card has always been a fiction. And it has not been black people who have raised it. It has been other people who raised it because black people say, I want you to stop oppressing me. Well, that means you didn't use the race card, right? Simply because you object to someone oppressing you, that means you have just pushed the race card, because we are a meritocracy society where your skills and talents and abilities are supposed to be the only variable that allows you to advance. Nonsense. But anyway, when we look at where we are today, the same question has to be raised. Where are we trying to go with the field today? How does the practice look, and does the practice need to look different because the circumstances have changed? They're not the same. Because back then, we were just starting the nascent process. Today, we have sophisticated institutions, community development corporations, community development finance institutions, community development credit unions. We have intermediaries. We have a whole system, and as it is called, an industry. Well, how does all that relate to this kind of stuff? How does this relate to changing people's lives? How does this relate to making a difference to the quality of people's lives? How does the industry system relate to the justice question is the fundamental issue, because what these young people are telling us through their actions and through their social movements is, look, when we march and when we demonstrate, when we finish, they always ask us, well, do you have a program? And some of the older elders say to them, too, well, you got protests, but you don't have a program. In other words, what are you going to do after you have engaged in direct action? So they go back to the same question and say, look, our communities are still being oppressed and exploited by the police on one hand, but by all these other institutions around us on the other hand. So the economic justice issue arises all the time because they are saying to the young people, if you had something to do as an alternative, would you do it? Or when explanations are asked for about why people are engaged in what they're engaged in at the level of the street, invariably it comes back to there isn't much to do. There aren't jobs, good paying jobs, or there are jobs in the informal economy, in the illegal economy. There are plenty of jobs over there. And that's why most people go over there. But at the level of what the decision makers say to people, what philanthropists often say is, well, how do we move from where you are to another level of engagement, another level of the process, from the street to the park, or from the street to the schoolroom, or from the street to housing that you can control, that's affordable to you? How do you get from one point to the other point, and what are the tools and techniques that you need to do that? That's where progressive community development thinking can make a difference. That's where progressive movement can matter, because progressive movement would still see some of this as relevant to the question being asked by social justice movement. One of the weaknesses that I think happened with Occupy is that they were disconnected from other questions. They had a good macroeconomic analysis, but they didn't understand neighborhood and communities, and so they were disconnected. They did not connect to other social movements that could have potentiated their own movement by asking another set of questions. And perhaps they found that out, but it may have been a little late for them to have figured it out. But as we look at the environmental justice movement, there's an economic empowerment component to that. But are the so-called CED practitioners connected to the economic empowerment side of the environmental justice movement? I'm not sure that I see that all the time. The Hip Hop Caucus, the Progressive Hip Hop Caucus, which is a human rights movement and a powerful messenger for social justice, has an economic empowerment component to it. But is CED practice connected to one of the most powerful communicative forms of our society today that would help promote the question of justice and balanced distribution and balanced participation? I don't always see that. Does the Black Lives Matter movement have a program to translate its legitimate protest interest, its legitimate advocacy interest, into what might be called progressive development? I'm not sure the link has been made. So there are many things that would suggest themselves as relationships that progressive community development could potentially engage in with the emerging social justice movements, which is the issue that is on the table today, I think, in many ways. Now, I want to wrap this up quickly so that we can have at least an opportunity for some conversation. If we were to just take a quick look back, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s might be said to be the period in which CED could have been defined still as a movement. This is when you have the early community development corporations and the so-called emerging community development corporations. Some people even think that the CDCs themselves is part of what weakened the CED movement. That is to say, that is how the justice dimension of CED was eliminated, because those movements had to concern themselves with social production, which meant they had to focus on ensuring that they got their grants from philanthropic sources and from government sources. And to maintain those grants meant that they had to sacrifice or trade off the advocacy work that was necessary to promote social justice issues. So that if you wanted to do development, you couldn't also do advocacy. There were a lot of CDCs that were also comprehensive, also supposedly holistic. They did goods production, but they provided services, and they also still did advocacy. I can think of a number of them that maintained a good balance of that nature. But I can also think of a whole range of them that sacrifice the advocacy work in order to sustain the development work. The price they had to pay was alienation of their community, because they also had to eliminate, or at least to tone down, the notion of community-based involvement. If you wanted to do housing financing and all of that, for instance, you couldn't often do it with a community base, because community people, low-income people who were not professional at this, were often perceived as obstructionists, that they got in the way. They interfered with the professional development of the project, and therefore you had to eliminate them, or at least modulate their participation. So in the latter 80s to the 90s, an official split happened between the language of movement and the language of a social production industry. The social production industry became the dominant form of CDC presence, and many of the earlier CDCs that were balanced, comprehensive, and still focused on justice actually began to diminish in significance, in funding, and in importance. And that was an unfortunate development, because there's some relevance to providing goods and services in a people's community if it can remain linked to transformation of that community. Because some of us do believe that justice could only be obtained if you modify the relationship of domination and subjugation. That you cannot keep the relationship between oppressor and the oppressed intact and think that justice will result. You could build 1,000 units of housing, but if there is still this suppressed relationship, this oppressor to subjugated relationship intact, what difference does it make? That I live in a finer, less expensive house, but I am still oppressed, I am still manipulated, I'm still dominated, I'm still controlled, I am still taught that I am not who I am as a human being, but I should imitate another people who I am not. Is that making any sense? For somebody to keep telling you that you're somebody who you're not is oppressive. But we live in a system that does that. So I'm simply saying that you cannot just have something called development and leave systems of oppression intact. You can have growth and do that, but you can't have development, because development implies a change in the quality of life of people. Growth means I have just multiplied the units of production. But development can only occur when the lives of people are changing, when they are more empowered, when they feel a sense of justice, where the yokes of oppression and exploitation have been thrown off. But has that been achieved perfectly? No, absolutely not. We're still struggling with that issue. So a fundamental question is, can community economic development remake itself in order to contribute to the social justice movement of today around the obvious issues that are on everybody's agenda, whether they call themselves CED practitioners or EJ practitioners. Things like livable wages. There's a powerful livable wage movement going on in the country. Where should the CED movement be in relationship to it if it wants to still call itself a movement? Does the social production industry side of it have an interest in this? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But maybe it can, maybe it cannot be a party to this. But those of us who are justice workers should see livable wage as something critically important to the constituency we have been fighting for over the last half a century. A critical issue because poverty is still rampant, as the first session will talk about. Inequality and poverty are still why you had CED, and it's still why there is injustice. It's still why there are social movements in the country. Inequality, the depth of it, and poverty in those neighborhoods that we've been working in are still there. One way to attack that is by having livable wages. I know that in the city of New Orleans, like other places, if you provided livable wages to most of the workers, you could cut the poverty level down from the present 55% to about 10%. If there were livable wages paid to the workers in the hospitality industry. But those people who call themselves CED practitioners are immune to this. They don't get involved in it. That's not their interest. And when the Katrina destruction happened, they were irrelevant. They simply were absent without leave. They were AWOL. And the city got rebuilt for the rich and for the wealthier whites who took advantage of it. And lower income black people were programmed out of the city. That's why 100,000 people didn't go back. You can't live there because it's too expensive. It's richer than it used to be, and it costs more. The housing rates cost more for rental units. The housing rates for home ownership are higher. The CED movement was silent and couldn't do anything about it. I felt sorry and sad about that. I called Michael one day crying about it. Where the hell's the CED movement? Was absent without leave. So that tells us that what we traditionally call CED can't do everything. It can't resolve all of the contradictions in the neighborhoods and communities. Maybe we need some new thinking and some new thinkers to ask a new set of questions about some of the deeper issues. But the livable wage movement, like it or not, is in process. Will we be with it or will we be marginal to it? My contention is that if you're justice workers, you have to find a way to support this because it impacts what we've been fighting against, the marginalization of people. Another good example is first source agreements. That's an old tool. We've been doing that one for good 40 years now. You know, where you ensure that people from that community are the ones who get the chance at the best employment as the trade-off for a municipal jurisdiction using public sources to attract projects into the city, whether it's the bond money or infrastructure or housing funds or whatever, but there's, that government signs an agreement. And you see, these are normative. This is not even new, it's not even a fad. It's something that is deeply rooted in public policy today, but a lot of justice actors do not advocate when those issues get put on the agenda and have to be struggled for in a city. Many of the justice advocates who do so-called CED work aren't there. Once again, they're absent. Domestic content, that you will not only have first source hiring agreements, but you will use locally based contractors, minority-based contractors, women-based contractors, and increasingly accessing immigrants in the community into these economic opportunities. Again, this is an old technique, but it is one of the economic justice issues on the table. Property transfers in Baltimore, all those vacant units that are there. Is there a way that that can be transferred to community-based organizations? I don't know the answer, but when you have thousands of vacant units like that, the issue is there a way to turn those units over? We used to do land trusts to do that. We used to do housing trusts to do that. But I don't hear the demand that vacant units be turned over to community-based organizations, in part because those units are market-owned. Well, we know what the market does, though. That's why we have gentrification. Because we don't own the rent. I mean, you know, African Americans, for instance, only two-thirds of them are renters. That's why it's easy to gentrify. And gentrification can be by race or it can be by class. Doesn't matter. You know, a higher income group comes in, moves another group out. Somehow we got to break the stranglehold over the issue of vacant property, property transfer, but also find a way to stop the displacement that is taking place because people do not actually own the units. Another example is just good, high-paying jobs. The question is not whether they're jobs. Remember, black people worked during slavery. You may think that's an extreme statement, but it's a true statement. Everybody was fully employed if you were black during slavery. You didn't have the option. You had to work. You weren't compensated. That's the problem. That's why there's a reparations movement in this country, and it hasn't gone anywhere. And you may look at me and say, man, what you talking about reparations for? Other people have gotten reparations, haven't they not? Have they not? They were considered human beings. Others have gotten reparations in the world. And to me, there's nothing wrong if you have injured someone and you owe them, you ought to pay them. And I firmly believe America owes African Americans something. I believe they owe Native Americans something. I believe they owe Latinos something. I believe they owe Asians something. And I believe they owe women something too. And ought to pay up. The patriarchy of America ought to pay up. Now, that may seem a radical statement to some of you, but talking about justice and whether justice practitioners will be bold enough to demand justice for people, that's one of the issues that is out there about employment. Do I get access to the very good jobs? And what about good schools and healthcare? See, that's a part of developing people. So you can't talk about I'm going to do housing and not figure out how to do affordable housing linked with it and making schools work. Because that's one of the biggest issues in communities today is this link between jobs, healthcare, housing, education. We used to think like that in the field. We stopped thinking like that. I'm saying this is an economic justice question that I hear these young people raising all the time. And then one more example is equity policies. And equity policies are increasingly the way that you compel a municipality to use its resources to reduce disparities in a community. Portland and Seattle have done a very good job of that. But what happens is you introduce a policy so that when the city budgeting starts, the city budgeting process starts, it's got to be evaluated in relationship to disparities that will be decreased and inequities that will be reduced. And if it doesn't do that, then the budget has to go back to review until it shows that there will be some impact on the inequities and the disparities in the city. Now, there are many more ways you can define economic justice. I just put this set up here because these are practical ways that CED practitioners, progressive ones, can participate in the social justice movements that are saying we need something other than our protest activities and something other than our direct action, and suffer the criticism by outsiders all the time that says, well, after you have protest, then what? Or you don't have a program, which is often the criticism. You're doing A, but you don't have a B. And so they're asking the question in many places, how do we connect the progressive justice movements in our city, town, or wherever to pragmatic things that we all can do? Now, I'm not going to claim that if this is done, all problems of neighborhoods and communities will be resolved, because there is still a deeper problem. And that is, at this era, in the development of the globalized capitalist system, there are some people like Piketty who argue there are no longer nation-state solutions. Capital is in motion, capital is dominating the whole world, and there are no longer single-state solutions. Well, maybe there are no longer single community solutions. Maybe much of the problem is scale, that we may have had some good ideas, but we never had the scale, the level of resources coming from wherever the resources come from to address the problem, which means we cannot absent ourselves from wherever decisions get made in the public sector or the private sector and be silent and quiescent. Trade policy is an issue for us. Trade agreements is an issue for us. How dollars come in and out of America is an issue for us. state budgets, the federal budget, all of those things that are affecting our people are issues that we must be involved in, like it or not, if the practice is to be relevant in the times that we're living in. So, having said all of that, let's talk for a few minutes. Let's have some conversation. Let's have some Q&A. Let's have some responses, and see how this resonates, because that's part of what we're trying to talk about while we're here. This connection between economic justice and what we call community economic development that used to be a part of the justice movement but took itself out of the justice movement. And our question is, can we put it back in the interest of what these young people are telling us about the world today? Because if we don't, they're going to keep burning it down. And that's the reality that we're living in. And if we don't offer them an option for a future, we will lose them. We will lose an entire generation if we do nothing. And I say, I'm not going to be quiescent. To my very fiber in my bone, I'm going to do everything that I can in the interest of what happened when I was their age, where the same set of issues arose in a different way, and we tried to burn it down then. But we also learned that if we didn't have a program, then the justice we sought would be very limited. And that's part of why some of us launched the community control movement, the CED movement in the first place. It was a justice issue then. It's still a justice issue now. But we got to be bold enough to say that our practice is about justice. However we practice it, it's about justice, and it's about eliminating oppression and exploitation of people in neighborhoods and communities wherever we find it. So to me, that is the challenge that I think is the one that is before the field today. It's the one that is before the practice. So let me hear any questions or any comments, any observations.